He was not a pre-march. He was not a god. But without him, neither would have ruled mankind. Ash fell like snow on the bones of Terra. A lone figure walked through the ruins of the cradle of mankind. Robes charred, staff cracked, eyes like suns dimming beneath centuries of watching. Not a titan, not a demigod, not a warrior bathed in legend, but still the silence bowed before him. Every step he took pressed memory into stone. Every breath summoned ghosts. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's shadow, the last weapon. There is a place, some say it no longer exists, where Malcador once stood before the Golden Throne, alone, whispering to its terrible presence as Terra burned, not as a servant, not as a son, but as a soul too ancient to break, and too loyal to ever bend. He did not raise cities. He did not win battles. But the Imperium as we know it exists only because he died for it. And still, the galaxy barely remembers his name. You click this because you've heard the whispers, seen the theories, the fragments, the myths. Who was Malcador, really? Why was he the only being the Emperor trusted beyond blood? Why does his legacy feel like a memory half erased? As if someone wanted it that way. Stay, because this isn't a history lesson. This is the story of the Emperor's last weapon, and the man who may have been the Imperium's last chance to remain human. Chapter 1, The Emperor's Shadow, who was Malcador. In a galaxy of flame and heresy, few figures are more cloaked in deliberate ambiguity than Malcador. Even among those who revere him, the truth is wrapped in half-truths, veiled by propaganda, forgotten by design. Because Malcador was never meant to be seen. He was not a pre-march, not a superhuman warlord bred for conquest. He was older than them. In some texts, far older. He was there before they fell from the stars, before the legions marched, before the Imperium had even drawn breath. If the Emperor was the sword of mankind, Malcador was a sheath, the structure, the law, the unspoken restraint. Some call him a powerful psyker, second only to the Emperor himself. Others whisper he was far more than that. An ancient remembrancer of the old knight, a relic of the pre-imperial age, whose knowledge of humanity's fall and the horrors that led to it gave him a unique role in shaping its rebirth. But he never wanted thrones. He never led armies. He was a vizier, the philosopher king behind the Crimson Curtain, the man whose mind carried the weight of history like a buried knife. While the Primarchs were forged in myth and flame, Malcador stood beside the Emperor not as an equal, but as a necessary counterbalance, the voice of sanity to the Emperor's godlike will, the one soul permitted to question him without fear. What kind of mind must that be? To advise the most powerful being in existence and survive? It is said that he was with the Emperor when the Sigillite first emerged during the Unification Wars, when the broken world of Terra was stitched together by gene-forged might and psychic fire. Malcador did not command thunder. He commanded silence. He moved not with armies, but with words, secrets, manipulations, the tools of empire too delicate for battlefield hands. In the Imperial Palace, Malcador was more than a vizier. He was the Emperor's confidant, the keeper of forbidden truths. The master of quiet wars fought in candlelit corridors while the stars outside burned. Where the Primarchs carried ideologies, Malcador carried burdens. While Horus dreamed of conquest, Guilliman of law, and Magnus of knowledge, Malcador dreamed of survival. He did not believe in utopias. He knew better. He believed in the long game, the great choices, the ugly truth that to build something eternal in a galaxy of monsters, one must become a little monstrous too. And so, the Emperor gave him tasks no Primarch would touch. There are fragments, shattered accounts from rogue Mechanicus archives and forbidden Black Library vaults, that hint Malcador may have known of the ruin storm before it came, that he predicted not just rebellion, but corruption. that while the Emperor sought to master the warp through control and denial, Malcador walked through it awake. He was no blind acolyte. He knew what chaos was. And that makes his loyalty even more terrifying, because he followed the Emperor anyway. To understand Malcador, one must look at him not as a man, but as an archetype, the eternal vizier, the Merlin to Arthur, the Chiron to Achilles, the philosopher in the shadows, who shapes the age but never rules it. Every empire has one, the mind behind the mask, the strategist too dangerous to be loved, but too vital to be lost, and every one of them dies alone. There is no mythic glory in what Malcador did. There are no statues that can hold his contradictions. He believed in unity, but used lies to enforce it. He upheld reason, but sanctioned murder to protect it. He served the Emperor, but questioned his vision, perhaps more than any pre-March ever dared. And unlike the demigods, Malcador was human. That is what makes him terrifying. That is what makes him tragic. Because where the Primarchs could blame their flaws on design, Malcador chose his path freely. He understood the cost. He paid it with eyes open. And when the time came, he burned for it. But that's later. Much later. For now, imagine him once more, alone in the vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, reading forbidden text by candlelight, fingers trembling not from fear, but from a knowledge that one day all of this would fail, and that someone would have to be the one who knew. Chapter 2, Master of Secrets, Architect of the Inquisition. They say knowledge is power, but Malcador knew the deeper truth. Knowledge is burden. Knowledge is liability. And sometimes knowledge must be buried alive. While the Imperium of the Great Crusade thundered across the stars, heralding a golden age of unity and reason, Malcador walked in the opposite direction, into the shadows. Where the Legion saw conquest, he saw cracks. Where others saw the warp as a tool, he saw a wound that never closed. It was not the Space Marines who first felt the rumblings of heresy beneath the skin of the Imperium. It was Malcador, because he had always known chaos was real, not as superstition, not as myth, but as a fundamental flaw in the human soul. And unlike the Emperor, who sought to deny its name, Malcador stared directly into its void. He read the oldest texts, shards from before old night, fragments of the age of strife, whispers from the dark. He knew the truth that no one wanted to speak aloud. The warp was not just dangerous, it was sentient, and it was watching. There's an apocryphal record, denied by every official archivist, that tells a hidden vault beneath the Imperial Palace. In it, a single room made of no stone. Inside, a chair, and on that chair, a figure, broken, malformed, whispering prophecies through a psychic veil. Some say it was a demon host captured during the Unification Wars. Others say it was a remembrancer who had seen too much. But whoever it was, Malcador sat before it every month and listened. No one knows what was said, only that after one such meeting, Malcador emerged pale, trembling, and immediately summoned 7 operatives. Those 7 would become the first Inquisitors. The truth is not a flame. It is a poison, and it must be contained. Malcador did not create the Inquisition as a police force. He forged it as a failsafe, a scalpel wielded not to punish ignorance, but to excise corruption before it bloomed. He knew that the greatest threats to mankind would never come from without. The Xenos empires, the Tyranids, the Orcs, they were loud, visible, brutal. But chaos? Chaos came as a whisper, a dream, a voice behind your thoughts telling you what you already wanted to believe. It had no form, and therefore it had infinite forms. The Imperium needed something equally formless to fight it, something flexible, unaccountable, untraceable. And so Malcador forged the Inquisition with 3 principles. Knowledge must never outpace discipline. power must be unanswerable, but invisible. No one, not even the Emperor, should be immune to scrutiny. He chose individuals, not warriors, not saints, but broken, brilliant humans who had seen the abyss and refused to blink. The first Inquisitors were not a council. They were a pact, a hidden circle of blades beneath the surface of the Imperium. One was a psyker who had survived the ruin storm. Another was a former word-bearer librarian, disavowed before Monarchia. A third was a mechanicum heretic who had studied warp-coded algorithms, each one a paradox, each one dangerous. But Malcador did not seek comfort. He sought tools. And when these first Inquisitors asked what their mission truly was, Malcador gave them an answer so stark, it chilled even their war-hardened minds. "You are not the shield of mankind," he said. "You are its firewall. You exist to burn corruption before it thinks itself real. And if one day the Emperor falls, you'll become what he no longer can, doubt made flesh." Some historians argue the Inquisition was a mistake, a door that once opened could never be closed. Others claim it was a necessary evil. But the truth, if you read between the blacked out lines, is far more uncomfortable. Malcador knew the Emperor might fail. He expected it. And so the Inquisition was not created as a supplement to Imperial law. It was created as its replacement, should the throne ever fall silent. Think about that. Really think. The Emperor's most trusted ally prepared a successor not for leadership, but for suppression, because somewhere, deep down, Malcador did not believe in the perfection of the Imperial truth. He believed in its necessity, but not in its purity. There's another theory, too dangerous to print openly, but whisper among radical Inquisitors, that Malcador's creation of the Inquisition wasn't just practical, it was personal. Some say he had already seen the future, that his psychic visions, burned into his skull from a lifetime near the Emperor's light, had shown him what would happen, that the heresy was inevitable, that no matter how perfect the design, the rot would rise, and perhaps, just perhaps, the Inquisition was not a stopgap, but a seed, a hidden hand meant to outlast even the Imperium itself. If that's true, then Malcador was not merely a vizier. He was an architect of the post-human age, an engineer of survival at any cost. But here's the tragedy. For all his foresight, all his planning, all his firewalls, they still failed. The heresy came. The Inquisition was too young, too small, too hidden to prevent it. And Malcador, chess master 10,000 games, was forced to watch it unfold anyway. Some say he blamed himself. Others believe he never expected to stop the heresy, only to ensure that what came after would be ready. That's the deeper horror. Malcador didn't believe in saving the Imperium. He believed in making sure it endured, even in damnation. Imagine him in the hours after Istvan, reports flooding in, legions turning, the galaxy unraveling. He doesn't cry. He doesn't rage. He moves. Quietly. Precisely. Orders are dispatched. Inquisitors vanish into deep space. Archives are sealed. Operatives go silent. Malcador begins a real war. The invisible one. The war for mankind's soul. A war that never ended. Chapter 3. The Webway Project and the Price of Silence. Beneath the Imperial Palace, there is a scar, not a metaphor, not a symbol, a literal, unhealed wound in reality itself, a psychic tunnel drilled through unreality, held in place by pain and sacrifice, a gate that never should have been opened, a project that was never finished, the Webway Project, the Emperor's great secret, and Malcador was its silence. It is hard to overstate what the Webway Project represented. At the height of the Great Crusade, as the Imperium thundered across the stars, the Emperor worked in silence beneath Terra, alone, apart, and unseen. While his sons fought and bled for his dream, He toiled on a greater vision, a galaxy-spanning human webway. No longer would humanity need warp travel or be exposed to demons and madness. No longer would psychers fall prey to possession. No longer would chaos have a doorway into the soul of mankind. It was more than a shortcut, more than safety. It was freedom, an escape from the warp itself. But here's the unspoken truth. The Emperor did not build that project alone. Malcador kept it hidden. While the Emperor labored with arcane science and lost Eldar sorcery, Malcador ensured that not a whisper would reach the outside world. Not the High Lords, not the Primarchs, not even those most loyal. He lied to them all. He created false documents, misdirected Mechanicum adepts, staged entire operations to throw off curious minds. Because if Chaos ever learned what was being built beneath Terra, they would destroy it. And yet, it failed anyway. No one knows the full details. The archives are sealed in black. The Mechanicum will not speak of it. The Adeptus Custodes guard the silence like a wound that still bleeds. But some fragments have survived. It is said that the Emperor miscalculated, that to bore a stable path into the Webway from real space, even he needed more power than anticipated. Or perhaps something was waiting for him in that place between worlds. Something older than chaos. Something that remembered humanity. Whatever the cause, the breach occurred. The Webway ruptured. Demons spilled like blood through a torn vein. The project fell into disaster. And the Emperor was trapped, locked on the throne, holding the gate closed not with machines, but with mind and soul. A living dam against the endless tide. But here is where Malcador's story darkens beyond recovery, because he said nothing. The Webway's failure was the most catastrophic event of the entire Great Crusade. It changed the Emperor's role, paralyzed Terra's defenses, left the Imperium without its guiding will. But no one outside the palace knew, because Malcador made sure they didn't. He intercepted messages, silenced witnesses, eliminated leaks. The Primarchs were told the Emperor had retreated to his work, that his silence was strategic, that his orders still carried forward the dream, but the dream was already dead, and only Malcador knew it. Why? Why hide such a critical failure? The answer is bitter and horrifyingly rational, because morale matters. Because if the legions knew their father had failed, that his great work was undone, they would falter, doubt, question the foundation of everything they fought for. And in doubt, chaos grows. Malcador chose silence, because the alternative was civilizational collapse. He chose a lie, so vast, so absolute, that it rewrote history itself. And in doing so, he damned himself. He knew Magnus would come. He knew, long before the flesh change took hold, long before the 1,000 Suns became pariahs. Malcador had studied Magnus' path, his beliefs, his hunger. He admired him, but he also feared him, because Magnus believed in knowledge without limit. And Malcador knew where that road ended. When Magnus broke the Emperor's wards and shattered the secret, the Webway was already bleeding. Magnus had only tore it open wider. And yet, Malcador did not condemn him. In private, behind closed doors, some say Malcador wept, not because Magnus had disobeyed, but because he had done so for love, and because Malcador had done worse, for less think of the burden. To see your lie consume everything. To know the heresy was sparked in part by the secrets you kept. To hold the greatest collapse of the Imperium in your hands and not flinch. That was the price of silence. That was the cost of loyalty. And still, he did not stop. Malcador did not run. He did not confess. He did not retreat into guilt. He moved. As the galaxy tore itself apart, as Horus rose and the stars burned, Malcador activated ancient protocols. He initiated fallback measures buried since the dawn of the palace. He took direct control of Terra's defenses, and most importantly, he prepared for the final contingency, because he knew what was coming. He knew that one day, the Emperor would fall silent forever, and someone would have to take his place, if only for a moment. In the final months of the siege, Malcador spent more and more time near the Golden Throne. He studied it, spoke to it, listened. Some believe he was preparing for the impossible. Others say he was already dying. What's certain is this: Malcador knew the Webway could never be sealed forever. That one day, the dam would crack. That Terra would need more than warriors and saints. It would need someone to hold the line against unreality itself. And when that day came, Malcador stepped forward. But that is a death reserved for later. For now, remember this. When you hear someone speak of the Emperor's failure, when they ask why Terra still depends on a throne that barely works, when they wonder why no one ever speaks of the Webway anymore, understand that silence was engineered, not by the Emperor, by Malcador, and it has never stopped echoing. Chapter 4. The Ethic of Control, Malcador versus Magnus. It is a bitter irony, lost on most chroniclers of the heresy, that the most devastating conflict in mankind's history may have been born not from ambition or hatred, but from a disagreement between two minds that both sought the truth. One dreamed with open eyes, the other watched with them closed. Both were loyal, both were loved, and both were doomed. Malcador, Magnus, they were never enemies. That's the tragedy. Not truly, not until the end. One, a mortal man honed by centuries into a weapon of measured silence. The other, a pre-march forged from divine spark. Gifted with a mind that could tear through reality like parchment. Both walked the warp. Both felt the screams behind the veil. Both saw the shape of what was coming. But only one dared to challenge the limits imposed upon him. Only one believed the Emperor was wrong to keep humanity in ignorance. And it cost him everything. They spoke once alone, before Prospero, before the Book of Magnus, before it all shattered. No records exist of that meeting, but fragments remain, dream visions, psychic echoes, half-remembered thoughts torn from minds too weak to hold them. What they discussed cannot be known, but we can guess. Magnus, driven by hunger, by vision, by a longing to pierce the veil of the immaterium and bring light to the darkest places. Malcador, bound by experience, by scars, by the memory of empires devoured by exactly that kind of light. Two psychers at the height of their power, one speaking in stars, the other in ciphers. Magnus believed knowledge was liberation. Malcador believed it was erosion, and neither could convince the other. This was not a clash of logic. It was a clash of ethics. Magnus sought to teach, to lift mankind into psychic adulthood. He believed that to shelter humanity from the warp was to deny its potential, that the Emperor's restrictions, his silence, his refusal to explain, was not protection, but control. He was not entirely wrong. Malcador believed in control because he had seen what happened without it, not in theory. In reality, he had watched psychically active civilizations collapse from within. He had read the scripts of dead species who screamed through the warp until something answered. He did not fear knowledge. He feared what followed it. Magnus asked, "If humanity is to survive, must it not evolve?" Malcador answered, "Survival is evolution, but evolution is not always progress." These were not mere philosophical exercises. The fate of 10 billion worlds hung in the balance of these questions. When Magnus defied the edict of Nicaea, when he reached out toward his father a Horus betrayal, he did so not from pride, but desperation. He believed, and Malcador could only watch. Imagine him, seated alone in the Tower of Hegemon, sensing the psychic scream from Prospero flare across the void. He knows what it means. He knows what it will cost. He does not speak, because he already tried to warn the Emperor, because the die was cast long ago. The most tragic part is this. Malcador may have admired Magnus more than any other pre-march. Not for his loyalty. Lorgar was loyal once. Not for his strength. Russ had strength in oceans. But because Magnus dared to question. Because he was, in a way, what Malcador once had been, before the long years, before the compromises, before the burden, a soul still brave enough to hope. And that was why Malcador knew Magnus had to be silenced, not out of malice, not out of envy, out of necessity. Because in a galaxy teetered on the edge of madness, idealism was more dangerous than heresy. And so, when the wolves of Rust descended on Prospero, Malcador did not protest. When the thousand suns burned, when the Cyclopean I closed in betrayal, when Magnus was shattered by the very gods he tried to understand, Malcador did nothing, because he had already chosen his truth. That control was mercy, that silence was survival, and that the alternative was chaos. But even that conviction would be tested, because as the heresy unfolded, as worlds fell and brothers turned on each other, Malcador found himself asking, over and over, alone in the psychic quiet, did Magnus see something I didn't? Did he see farther than I was willing to look? Was he not the mad one, but the honest one? These questions had no answers, only consequences. After Magnus' fall, Malcador would use what remained of the thousand suns, those who survived the burning, to reinforce his own networks. He stripped knowledge from their ruins. He harvested prophecies from their broken libraries. He turned the ashes of Prospero into fuel for the next war. A quiet kind of cannibalism. And yet, even in that, there was grief. He did not hate Magnus. He mourned him, because in another age, in another reality, they might have stood side by side, not as enemies, but as twin architects of a wiser Imperium. But this is not a story of what might have been. This is Warhammer, where hope dies screaming. And the question is never who was right. The question is only who was left. Chapter 5. The Sigilites' tools, assassins, lies, and silent wars. They call him the Sigillite, the bearer of seals, the keeper of authority. But the truth is colder. Malcador was not a man of symbols. He was a man of knives, silent ones, buried deep, removed before anyone noticed a wound. The legions waged war in light. Malcador waged it in silence. His battlefield was not Cadia or Kolth. It was the soul of the Imperium itself. And he fought with tools few dared acknowledge. Even now, black books, blacker orders, and a network of death wound tighter than any legion's chain of command. While the Primarchs debated doctrine and valor, Malcador curated a list of threats that could not be debated, only erased, and he did not hesitate. Because where others saw treason as ideology, he saw it as infection, to be cut out before it spoke, before it grew teeth, before it asked questions. No trials, no spectacle, just removal, the officio assassinorum. Most believe it was the Emperor's creation, but the truth is more nuanced. The assassins were born from the same cold clarity that shaped the Inquisition. From Malcador's understanding that power, if unchecked, decays into madness, that even the greatest champions of mankind, if given enough time and silence, would devour the very thing they were meant to protect. Malcador didn't build statues. He built contingencies. A temple where no light was permitted, for clades at first. Vindicare, Calidus, Everzer, Culexis, each designed to be an answer to a very specific type of problem. Each one trained, conditioned, sculpted into something that was no longer human, but still operated within human necessity. And behind him, he did not direct them in person. Often, that was beneath him, but every major operation in the early years bore his seal. There's a report sealed in an inquisitorial vault buried under 200 layers of scry-shielded encryption that details an assassination order signed not by the High Lords, not by the Emperor, but by Malcador himself, the target, a Lord Commander of the Saturnine subfleet, who had begun to ask the wrong questions about warp inconsistencies along his patrol line. The method of death, an Everzer kill team, deployed aboard his ship mid-jump. By the time the fleet emerged, their leader was ash and bone and the records cleansed. That wasn't an act of treason. It was an act of maintenance. Malcador knew the truth about Empire. It requires pruning. Not once, not occasionally, constantly. And the deeper the roots grow, the more rot collects in the soil. You can't lead 10 billion worlds with speeches and medals. You lead them with shadows. There are whispers of the Black Books, ancient ledgers encoded in psychic glyphs, accessible only to the Emperor, Malcador, and a handful of others now long dead. Each entry is a name, each name a potential disaster. Rogue psychers, radical mechanica minds, proto-rebellions still in utero, even loyal commanders who showed too much curiosity, not guilt, curiosity. That was enough. And Malcador would never admit regret. He saw the alternatives. He had studied the collapse of the Federation during the Age of Strife, where a single AI uprising burned across 5 sectors in a week. He had read accounts of warp-possessed philosophers whose ideas infected entire populations, not with magic, but with belief. Belief that they could understand chaos without succumbing to it. A fallacy Magnus had proven fatal. So Malcador acted, preemptively, without pause, because hesitation was death, because compromise was heresy in slow motion. He didn't believe in moral purity. He believed in necessary obscenity, in the quiet atrocities that must be done so that greater ones never occur. Take the Alfarius conundrum. Before the heresy, before even the full mustering of the legions, a theory existed, buried in the deep stratums of Imperial intelligence, that a certain pre-March had made contact with unknown entities beyond the galactic rim, that he had been compromised, not visibly, not overtly, but ideologically. There was no proof, only patterns, shifts in language, gaps in the psychic record, a shadow beneath the signal. Malcador had the file sealed, and he wrote in the margin a single sentence: if proven, execute Contingency V. Contingency V referred to a sleeper Vindicare agent embedded inside the Legion's orbiting supply ships, authorized to collapse the entire deployment structure of Alpha Legion if given a single Sigillite command. The plan was never activated, but the fact that it existed tells you what kind of mind Malcador carried. He didn't wait for fire. He studied the smoke, the wind, the angle of the sun, and prepared to detonate the forest. There are those who call him monstrous for it. Others call him the last rationalist in a galaxy falling into myth. Both are right, and neither are enough, because Malcador did not enjoy what he became. He understood it, and that distinction is all that separated him from monsters like Erebus or Fabius Bile. They enjoyed the shadows. Malcador endured them. He believed to the very end that he was doing what must be done, that without hands stained in quiet blood, the entire dream of mankind would collapse beneath its own illusions. He is said to have told an Inquisitor in one of their first meetings, "You are not a sword, you are not a shield, you are a scalpel, and you must cut the truth from the lie, even when the lie is loved." That is the ethic he passed on. Not glory, not honor, but usefulness. Even now, 10,000 years later, the Inquisition still carries out operations whose foundations were laid in his black books. Kill orders justified by axioms no longer understood, but still active. Assassins who move by protocols signed before the siege of Terra. Like ghosts, still loyal to a ghost. And perhaps that's the cruelest truth of all. Malcador never saw the fruits of his silent wars, only the wounds they left behind. Chapter 6. The Throne's Final Burden, Malcador's Death and What It Meant. They say the Golden Throne is a machine. They are wrong. It is a tomb, a throne of agony, forged not for dominion, but for containment, a prison for a god, built by a man who knew what gods truly are and what they cost. And once, for a single moment in all of time, it was Malcador who sat upon it. There is no image more tragic in all the chronicles of the Imperium than this. Malcador the Sigillite, aged beyond time, face like cracked parchment, robes heavy with dust and silence, seated on a relic built to enslave the Immaterium itself, not as a king, not as a ruler, as a stopgap, a mortal filling the seat of the divine. Because the emperor was dying during the siege of Terra, the palace was a bleeding wound on the face of earth. The skies were black with traitor vessels. Demons surged through breach points. Legions of the faithful were shattered against the endless tide of the corrupted. But inside the palace, deeper than the bombs could reach, deeper even than the custodes could tread, was the heart, the throne. And it was failing. The psychic demands of the Webway Gate had reached the breaking point. The Emperor, already stretched beyond mortal limitation, needed to leave the throne for a moment, an hour, a breath, to confront Horus directly. It was the only chance to end the war, but the gate could not go unguarded. If the Emperor left it, even for a moment, Terra would fall to the warp. The palace would implode into unreality. The souls of every loyal defender would be consumed. The last light of reason would be extinguished forever. Someone had to take his place. There was no question who it would be. Malcador did not hesitate. He did not request time. He did not ask what it would cost. He simply walked forward and sat. What happened next, no one can fully describe, not even the Emperor. What little we know comes from custodes who witnessed the moment through data feeds, from psychic echoes embedded in the palace stone, from the tremors in the Astronomicon that followed. The moment Malcador took the throne, the warp recoiled. Imagine that. A mortal mind, flawed, finite, human, gripping the same leash the Emperor had used to bind the Webway, and succeeding. For a moment, a breath, an hour, the Golden Throne responded, not like it did to the Emperor, with divine synchronicity, but with respect. It accepted Malcador's will. He held the gate. The demons howled in fury. The Webway screamed. And through it all, Malcador endured. But the cost cannot be measured. The throne does not take energy. It takes essence. Every second upon it consumes identity. History, memory. It scrapes away the self, layer by layer, until only the psychic engine remains, a battery made of soul. And Malcador, for all his will, was still only human. By the time the Emperor returned, bloodied, broken, victorious, Malcador was no longer whole. He was dying. No, not dying. Dissolving. He had been stripped down to something barely recognizable. His body was ash. His mind tattered smoke. His voice gone. And still, he smiled. The Emperor approached. Malcador looked upon him one last time. And with the final shreds of his being, he gave thanks. Not for life. For purpose. Then he died. Or perhaps became something else. The mysteries of the throne deepened that day. Some claim Malcador did not truly die. That part of him was absorbed into the throne's mechanisms. That whispers in the new sphere echo with his tone. That Inquisitor sometimes hear his voice in dreams, guiding, warning, remembering. Others say that what died that day was not a man, but the last semblance of morality the Imperium possessed. Because after Malcador, there was no one left who could say no to the Emperor. No one left who could weigh necessity against hope. No one left to remind the Imperium that humanity was the point, not survival at any cost. There's a theory, long suppressed, that the Astronomicon itself, the psychic beacon by which ships navigate the warp, only works because Malcador's death created a template, that the Emperor, by sitting upon the throne in Malcador's place, built upon the residue left by the Sigillite sacrifice, that his last act wasn't just martyrdom, it was infrastructure. He became the spiritual foundation of the entire Imperium's future, the light in the darkness, the fire that dies so others can see. But there's something colder beneath that, something more terrifying, because if the Golden Throne consumes its occupant, and if Malcador survived it, even for an hour, what exactly did he become? What fragment of his consciousness, shattered and burned, still lingers in the circuitry? What echo of Malcador remains beneath the throne, watching, listening? Does he approve of what the Imperium has become? Or does he scream, unheard beneath the gears? This is not how saints die. This is how warnings are buried, not with ceremony, with silence. And that is how Malcador passed into myth. Not as a hero, not even as a figure to be remembered, but as a foundation so essential, no one was allowed to speak his name again. Because to remember Malcador is to remember that there was once someone who chose sacrifice, not for power, not for glory, not for gods, but for the sake of holding the gate shut, just long enough. And no one since has ever done the same. Chapter 7. The Legacy That Never Spoke. Why the Imperium Forgot Malcador. There are statues across the Imperium, countless ones, towering monuments of marble and gold, towering effigies carved into the flanks of void ships and city spires alike. You will find the visages of primarchs, frozen in valiant defiance. You will see the Emperor, always larger than life, always divine. You will see saints, martyrs, warlords, and scribes. But where is Malcador? Search the great basilicas of Terra. Study the vaults of memory, the shrines of stone and flame. Look deep into the cathedrals of the ecclesiarchy, and you may find a single plaque, a rusted sigil, or perhaps a name long corroded. You will not find a statue that shows his face, because Malcador is not meant to be remembered. Not properly, not fully, not truthfully. That was a final command. Unwritten but absolute. Erase him. Not out of hatred, not out of vengeance, out of design. Because Malcador was never meant to inspire. He was meant to prevent, to contain, to end. And when the Emperor fell silent, the need for memory fell with him. This is a paradox of the Sigillite. He gave more than any being in Imperial history. He held the gate. He built the Inquisition. He laid the psychic bedrock for the Astronomicon. He wielded silence like a scalpel, sacrifice like a ritual, and war like an equation. And yet, in the age that followed, he became a whisper, a footnote, a mystery even to those who call themselves his inheritors. Why? Because Malcador was the last man who could ask why, and the Imperium that followed had no room for questions. It needed obedience. It needed faith. It needed fire and war uncertainty, not reflection, not ethics, not Malcador. When he died, so too did the final sliver of moral balance the Imperium possessed. The Emperor's silence was physical, literal, but Malcador's absence was ideological. It was intentional. The moment he vanished from the stage, the story changed, and the writers rewrote him. In the earliest iterations of the Lectitio Divinitatis, Malcador is a named figure, described not as a peer, but as a witness, a herald, a prophet who gazed upon the divine light of the master of mankind, and was consumed by it, a holy scribe who vanished in fire as the Emperor ascended. But over time, those references fade, revised, removed, not because they conflicted with dogma, but because they invited comparison, and that could not be tolerated. If Malcador remained in the minds of men, then so too would his actions, his counsels, his ethics, his questions. And questions are dangerous in a faith that must never falter. Even the Inquisition, his own creation, began to refer to him only in coded language. The first witness, the pale fire, the gray hand. Over millennia, his memory became the foundation of cultic circles and radical cells. But never doctrine, never law, because law requires recognition, and recognition requires vulnerability, and the Imperium has no space left for vulnerability. You might think this forgetting was accidental, a casualty of time, of distance, of propaganda. But look closer. It was deliberate. There's a vault beneath the Hall of Victories on Terra, sealed to all but the highest-ranking Lord Inquisitors. Inside is a record, sealed by Sigillite edict, detailing a protocol enacted by the High Lords themselves during the early years of the Scouring. Protocol Spectre Knot. Its purpose? To eliminate all references to Malcador in primary public records, to suppress mention of the Sigilite's involvement in post-heresy reforms, to recast the creation of the Inquisition as a divine mandate, not a pragmatic response to existential crisis, to ensure that the memory of nuance died, because Malcador represented a different vision of the Imperium, not weaker, not heretical, but humans, rooted in restraint, in foresight, in balance. He was not a god. He was not a demigod. He was a man who chose, again and again, to do what was necessary, even when it cost him everything. That is not a vision that can survive in a galaxy built on absolutes. And so, he was unmade, not with blades, with silence. But even silence leaves echoes. Across the Imperium, there are fragments, hidden cults that worship a faceless figure known only as the Keeper, cells of psychers who invoke a forgotten oath in the middle of battle, for the shadow who burned, rogue archivists who find patterns in redacted texts, patterns that point to a man who once knew the Emperor not as a god, but as a brother. These are not coincidences. These are scars. Malcador's legacy is not in stone or song. It is in doubt, in a handful of voices who still ask, what came before this faith? What was lost? The ecclesiarchy calls them heretics. The Inquisition calls them radicals. But they are, perhaps, the last remnants of the world Malcador tried to preserve. Not a world of peace. He never believed in that. But a world where sacrifice had meaning, where truth was not replaced by dogma, where silence was a strategy, not a creed. And now, we are left with fire. 1,000 worlds, all burning in his name. An Imperium that kills to survive, that survives to kill, but never asks why. Malcador would have asked why. He would have demanded it. And so, he had to be forgotten. There are still some, in the Ordos and the Black Ships, who believe that Malcador's final thoughts are encoded somewhere in the new sphere, that his last act was not to die, but to embed a psychic seed, a pattern, an idea so deeply buried in the arcane lattice of Imperial structure that it cannot be killed, only uncovered. If true, then Malcador is not vanished. He waits, not as a man, as a question, a pressure point, a ghost in the gears, waiting for someone, anyone, to remember, to ask, to reclaim the Imperium from the silence he once wove to protect it. But that reclamation would require honesty, and honesty in this age is the greatest heresy of all. So the Imperium will go on blind and burning, never knowing that it forgot the one man who tried to keep it human, and the throne will still hum, and the Astronomicon will still burn. And beneath it all, buried in circuits of memory and Blackstone echo, the last moral voice of the Imperium whispers, not in defiance, but in mourning, and the stars do not answer. They never have. If Malcador had lived, would the Imperium still be human? What is humanity in the age of the Imperium? Is it the flesh, bent beneath armor, shattered beneath lost fire, consumed in the billion-strong marches of endless war? Is it thought, bound in creed, silence and litany, twisted into dogmas so dense that even reason must kneel? Or is it something else? A question, a resistance, a moment of stillness before the war horn blares again. Malcador believed in humanity, not as an ideal, as a duty, a flame too easily snuffed out, a voice that could only survive if it was protected from the extremes of gods and monsters alike. And now he is gone, and the gods have won. The Imperium that survives him is vast, terrible, magnificent in its horror and scale. But it is no longer his Imperium. He did not fight to preserve this. He fought to preserve the possibility that something else might endure beneath it, some thread of meaning, some shadow of conscience. Did he fail? That question haunts the halls of the Inquisition, though they never speak it aloud. It lingers in the hearts of psychers who touch the throne's echo and feel something watching. Something not quite dead, not quite gone. It flickers in the black book still open in secret by radical Ordo Malleus cells, where ancient warnings etched in Malcador's own hand still burn with grim clarity. Do not become what you were forged to destroy. But what if there was no other path? What if the heresy made monsters of them all, and survival was the only victory left? What if the Emperor's dream could never have survived reality? Would Malcador have accepted that? Or would he have fought still? Not for peace, but for remembrance? There are many who believe that if Malcador had lived, the Imperium would look different. Not softer, never weaker, but guided, measured, capable of pulling back from the edge when necessary, not marching gleefully into the abyss. He might have kept the Inquisition honest. He might have reminded the ecclesiarchy that faith without wisdom is suicide. He might have built a bridge between silence and vision, between the Emperor's will and mankind's future. But perhaps that is the cruelest illusion of all, because if Malcador had lived, he might have become exactly what he feared most, a tyrant of reason, a god of necessary evils. Another voice silenced by the weight of empire. The Imperium does not allow survivors, only martyrs, only myths, and Malcador was both. They buried him beneath the throne, not in body, in function, his name erased, his questions unanswered, his legacy inverted, but he remains in fragments, in echoes, in the sudden cold you feel when reading too far into a forbidden tome, in the moment before an inquisitor casts judgment, when doubt flickers, in the wait behind a golden throne, where even the Emperor, silent and dying, once turned to a man not because he was strong or fast or divine, but because he understood, because he chose, and because he was willing to bear what no one else would. So remember him, not as a hero, not as a martyr. Remember him as the last one who could still ask the hardest question. If Malcador had lived, would the Imperium still be human? And if it's not, what does that make us?